What if I told you that Putin's most symbolic military prize is no longer acting like a fortress? What if the peninsula he spent 10 years militarizing, fortifying, and turning into the crown jewel of Russia's Black Sea power is now beginning to look less like an unsinkable bastion, and more like an isolated outpost whose commanders are quietly packing their bags? Because that is the picture now emerging from occupied Crimea. For years, the Kremlin sold one message to the Russian people: Crimea was forever. Crimea was protected, Crimea was untouchable. Crimea was the place where Russia had returned to greatness, where the Black Sea Fleet stood as a warning to NATO, Ukraine, and anyone else who dared challenge Moscow's claim over the peninsula. But today, that image is cracking. The fleet has already pulled many of its ships away. Air bases have been battered. Logistics routes are under fire. Fuel and food shortages are spreading. Bridges are being destroyed. Ferry routes are no longer reliable. And now, perhaps most importantly, command elements of the Black Sea Fleet are reportedly leaving Crimea for Novorossiysk. That is not just a relocation. That is a signal. In war, when ordinary soldiers see senior officers moving their families out, selling what they cannot carry, and settling into housing somewhere safer, they understand the message immediately. The message is simple. The people in charge no longer believe this place can be held in the old way. And that is why this moment matters. Before we go deeper, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who follows the war in Ukraine closely. Because what is happening in Crimea right now is not just another battlefield update. It may be the beginning of the collapse of one of the Kremlin's most important myths. Let's start with the symbol. In February 2026, the historic main headquarters building of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol was demolished. This was not just another military building. It had stood for more than a century. It had survived the Second World War. It had represented Russian naval power in the Black Sea across generations. But after being hit by Ukraine's Storm Shadow missile strike in 2023, the building was eventually declared beyond repair. And once demolition crews brought it down, the message became impossible to ignore. The old center of Russian Black Sea Command was gone. A retired Ukrainian naval officer put it brutally. There was nothing left to command in Sevastopol except old scrap and damaged ships. Now the story has moved into a new phase. According to reports from the Atesh partisan movement, the remaining command units of the Black Sea Fleet are being transferred to Novorossiysk. These are not minor staffers. We are talking about senior Fleet Command aviation headquarters personnel and support elements, the people who make the system work. The reported trigger came on May 27, when Ukraine struck the aviation headquarters on Gogol Street with Storm Shadow missiles and destroyed hardened communications infrastructure. After that, according to military informants cited by Atesh, officers began organizing their departure. And here is the part that tells you everything. They reportedly did not even wait for a clear order from Moscow. They started moving their families. They started getting rid of belongings they could not take. They started preparing new lives across the water in Novorossiysk. That is not confidence. That is flight. And the timing is not random. For weeks, unusual activity has been observed in and around Sevastopol. This city is not just a naval base. In Kremlin mythology, Sevastopol is the city of Russian military glory. It is the emotional center of the 2014 annexation narrative. It is where Putin's claim to Crimea became a political monument. But monuments do not stop missiles. And mythology does not keep logistics alive. The main headquarters has been demolished. Ships have left. Commanders are leaving. And the more this continues, the more Crimea looks less like the unsinkable aircraft carrier of Russian strategy and more like a trap that is becoming harder to supply, harder to defend, and harder to explain. Now let's talk about the problem facing anyone trying to get out. Because leaving Crimea is no longer easy. The first route is the Kerch Bridge. From Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, that means more than 500 kilometers by road, but the bridge has been attacked repeatedly throughout the war and has suffered serious damage. Dangerous cargo, including fuel tankers, faces restrictions. Traffic is regularly interrupted. Security checks can last for hours. And the longer those queues become, the more vulnerable they are. For the families of commanders, the idea of a safe exit route is fading. The second option is the sea route, but that route has also been hit hard. The last major ferry, the Slavian Inn, was reportedly sunk in April during a Ukrainian operation. Smaller ferries remain, but they have limited capacity, and Ukraine's naval drones are constantly patrolling the Kerch Strait. The third route is the land corridor through occupied territories, moving westward through the Mariupol-Rostov direction toward Novorossiysk. But that route has its own problems. The R-280 highway has reportedly been restricted for military cargo by Russia's own orders, and freight traffic has collapsed. Convoys are forced to move at night in smaller groups. But night no longer guarantees safety. Ukrainian drones with thermal cameras hunt in the dark. The fourth option is air evacuation. Technically, aircraft can move people from Sevastopol or Kerch, but those airports are under constant drone and missile threat, and this option is mostly available only to the highest-ranking officials. Even then, the destination is not truly safe. Novorossiysk itself has already been hit by Ukrainian drone and missile strikes. Port facilities, oil depots, and military infrastructure have all been targeted. So what Russian commanders are buying is not safety, they are buying distance. And even that distance may not be enough. Because Ukraine has developed long-range strike capabilities that make geography less comforting than it used to be. Now stop for a second and ask the real question. If the commanders are leaving, what does that mean for the tens of thousands of Russian soldiers still left behind in Crimea? The first effect is psychological. In any army, the behavior of command matters. Soldiers can tolerate hardship when they believe the chain of command is stable, confident, and committed. But when commanders move their families away, the ordinary soldier sees the truth before any official statement can hide it. He asks, if they are leaving, why are we staying? That question is poison inside a military formation. Once soldiers believe they are being abandoned, morale does not simply decline. It can collapse. And when morale collapses, the risk of disobedience, desertion, panic, and breakdown rises sharply. The second effect is operational. Moving decision-making centers across the Kerch Strait means units in Crimea lose real-time command support. Air defense coordination, coastal defense, logistics management, and communication between units all depend on command infrastructure. But that command structure is now being pushed hundreds of kilometers away into a different geography, while the communications network has already been damaged by strikes. The May 27 attack reportedly destroyed hardened communications systems and caused the loss of some documents. Rebuilding those systems in Novorossiysk will take time, equipment, and stability. And Crimea has very little of those things right now. During that gap, lower-ranking officers may be forced to make sudden decisions on their own, but those officers may not have the training, authority, or information needed to handle decisions at that level. That creates a dangerous vacuum. The third effect is combat coordination. Crimea is not just a garrison. It is part of Russia's southern front defense structure. It supports air defense coverage, intelligence coordination, coastal defense, and logistics toward the occupied south. When command breaks down, coordination between radar systems, S-400 batteries, aviation units, and ground forces becomes weaker. That makes Ukrainian strikes more effective. And then a vicious cycle begins. These strikes force command elements to leave. Command flight weakens defense. Weakened defense invites more strikes. And more strikes push the system closer to collapse. This is not limited to Crimea alone. Logistics coordination toward the Zaporizhzhia front has also been tied to this command structure. If command in Crimea weakens, the entire southern front feels the pressure. And now we reach the next question. Can Putin compensate? Can Moscow simply send new commanders, new troops, and new supplies into Crimea? On paper, maybe. In reality, the answer is far more complicated. Several months earlier, according to assessments cited in the original account, Russia was not reinforcing Crimea. It was pulling forces out of Crimea. Heavy casualties on other fronts forced Moscow to use Crimea's garrison as a reserve pool. The 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was shifted toward the Kursk direction. Other naval infantry formations were reportedly sent to reinforce the Zaporizhzhia front. That tells us something important. Crimea was already being drained before the command flight began. In March, soldiers were pulled away. In June, commanders started leaving. That means Crimea is losing both manpower and leadership. Could reinforcements be taken from other fronts? That is where Putin's problem becomes almost impossible. In the north, Russia is under pressure. Pulling troops from that sector risks opening new vulnerabilities. In the east, Russian forces remain tied down against Ukraine's defensive belts. Removing troops from there could destroy Moscow's offensive plans in Donbass. In the south, Russian formations have suffered heavy losses, and Ukraine's counter-offensive pressure has narrowed the land corridor. Every front needs more men. No front can easily spare them. And even if Putin sends reinforcements, he runs into the same logistical reality. Crimea's arteries are being cut. Adding more soldiers to a garrison that already struggles to receive fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts does not solve the problem. It makes the burden heavier. This is the trap. The more Russia tries to hold Crimea by force, the more supplies it needs. But the harder Ukraine hits Crimea's routes, the more expensive each ton of supply becomes. And the effects are no longer just military. Civilian life inside Crimea is also beginning to deteriorate. The fuel crisis is the most visible sign. On June 7, Ukraine reportedly struck Crimea's two largest fuel depots. After that, fuel distribution was suspended. A QR code coupon system was introduced, but then cancelled because there was not enough fuel left to distribute. The Russian-appointed governor of Sevastopol admitted the reality in a rare moment of bluntness. Waiting in line was pointless because fuel trucks could not reach the city. After fuel came food. Reports describe shortages of sugar, flour, grain, salt, pasta, and other basic goods in many stores across occupied Crimea. Retailers began imposing limits per customer. This was not just panic buying. Crimea does not have enough agricultural capacity to feed itself. It depends heavily on supplies from the mainland. And when the connection to the mainland breaks down, the shelves begin to empty. Vehicle crossings have dropped dramatically. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens settled on the peninsula since 2014 have increased demand even further. Soldiers' families, retirees, officials, and civilian settlers all need food, fuel, medicine, and water. More people. Less supply. That equation never ends well. Water is another danger. Bridges connected to the North Crimean Canal have been struck, and the canal system itself may be damaged. A major portion of Crimea's agricultural and drinking water depends on that infrastructure. So the pressure is not just on military bases. It is on the whole occupation system. And when soldiers are hungry, poorly supplied, nervous, and surrounded by civilians who are also desperate, a new danger appears. Analysts warn that armed units under severe supply stress can begin turning against the civilian population. History has shown this many times in isolated garrisons. Crimea may not be there yet, but the trajectory is moving in that direction. Even tourism is showing the collapse. Hotel occupancy has reportedly dropped sharply. Reservations have been cancelled in huge numbers. That matters because tourism was part of the normalcy illusion. The Kremlin wanted Crimea to look settled, safe, permanent, and Russian. But tourists do not come to a fortress under siege. One analyst compared the situation to the final days of the Soviet Union: goods disappearing from shelves, people searching for basics, and the system pretending everything is fine until the emptiness becomes impossible to hide. But unlike Soviet citizens who could travel to Moscow to find supplies, Crimea's civilians may not have a reliable route out. And this is not happening by accident. Ukraine is conducting a systematic campaign against Crimea's logistics network. Between June 7 and June 11, multiple bridges and crossing points connecting Crimea to the mainland were struck. Chongar, Arabat, Armyansk, North Crimean Canal bridges, and other crossings were hit. No major route was left untouched. Russia tried to set up pontoon crossings for repairs. Ukraine struck those too. Then, on the night of June 13, the campaign escalated again. Drone operators from Ukraine's 475th Regiment reportedly struck the Jankoy checkpoint, a railway bridge, pontoon crossings, and military transport vehicles. Jankoy is not just another town. It is Crimea's most important transport hub, where highways and railways connect the peninsula to Russian forces in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Disrupt Jankoy, and you disrupt the entire southern military network. Ukrainian operators have made the tactical shift clear. This is no longer about isolated bridge attacks. This is about continuous monitoring and hunting of enemy logistics lines. And logistics is not the only target. Ukraine is also hitting industrial infrastructure. On the night of June 13, drones struck the Crimean Titan chemical plant in Armyansk. According to the account, there were approximately 23 successful hits. Production stopped. Workers were evacuated. At first glance, a chemical plant may not sound as dramatic as a warship or a command center, but strategically it matters. Crimean Titan is one of Eastern Europe's major titanium dioxide producers. It also produces sulfuric acid, a key input in the production chain for artillery shells, explosives, and rocket fuels. Destroying ammunition depots has an immediate effect. Hitting the raw material chain has a longer-lasting effect. And then comes electricity. In the same wave of strikes, transformer centers linked to the peninsula's electrical grid were hit. These transformer nodes supplied power not only to cities, but also to industrial facilities and military bases. When they fail, everything becomes harder: production, communications, repairs, firefighting, and military operations. Reports even described firefighters working in darkness while Crimean Titan burned. This is the Ukrainian strategy in one sentence: hit transport, hit production, hit energy, and let each failure intensify the next. And the message from Ukrainian operators was clear. This is not the end. More is coming. That is why the fortress Putin built over 10 years is now unraveling in slow motion. After the 2014 annexation, Putin turned Crimea into a militarized platform. Air defense systems, Iskander ballistic missiles, Kalibr cruise missiles, submarines, warships, air bases, radar stations, all of it was deployed to make Crimea Russia's Black Sea shield. The Kremlin framed the peninsula as an anti-access fortress, a place where NATO and Ukraine could be kept at distance. It was central to Putin's image as the leader who restored Russian greatness. But the collapse began in 2022. Ukraine sank the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, with Neptune missiles. The symbol of Russian naval dominance went to the bottom of the sea. In 2023, the Kerch Bridge was struck, and the Black Sea Fleet headquarters was hit by Storm Shadow missiles. The perception of Crimea as untouchable was broken. In 2024, Ukrainian naval drones and missiles struck fleet ships one after another, forcing many vessels to withdraw toward Novorossiysk. In 2025, air defense batteries and air bases were targeted repeatedly. And by 2026, the final act appears to be underway. Headquarters demolished, bridges hit, fuel short, food scarce, logistics under attack, and command elements leaving. In 4 years, the so-called invincible fortress has been transformed into an increasingly isolated outpost. But let's be clear, Crimea has not fallen. Russia still controls the peninsula. Tens of thousands of soldiers remain there. Damaged air defense systems still operate. The Kerch Bridge road lane still provides some limited resupply. Moscow has adapted before. In Kherson in 2022, after bridges were struck, Russia still managed to supply its forces for months, using ferries and temporary crossings before conducting an organized withdrawal. So yes, Russia may adapt again. Air resupply, night convoys, alternative sea routes, more electronic warfare, tighter security, all of these are possible. And no one should underestimate the Kremlin's willingness to absorb pain, sacrifice troops, and prolong the war. But Crimea is different from Kherson. In Kherson, Russia could withdraw to the opposite bank of the Dnipro and build a new defensive line. It was humiliating but militarily possible. In Crimea, withdrawal is politically impossible. Crimea is not just territory to Putin. It is his personal prestige project. It is the crown jewel of the annexation narrative. It is the symbol he used to tell Russians that their country had risen again. If Putin loses Crimea, he does not just lose a military position. He loses the story he has been telling for more than a decade. If he stays, the cost rises every week. Every bridge destroyed, every ferry sunk, every fuel depot hit, every empty shelf, every panicked officer family, every weakened air defense battery increases the cost of holding the peninsula. And that cost is not abstract. It comes out of Russia's war budget. It drains resources from Donbas. It drains resources from the southern front. It forces Moscow to choose between holding the symbol and sustaining the war. That is Putin's dilemma. Holding Crimea weakens the wider war. Letting Crimea go destroys the myth. And right now the myth is already bleeding. Commanders are reportedly leaving without waiting for orders. The population is facing shortages. Military logistics are being hunted. Industrial nodes are burning. The Black Sea Fleet is no longer acting like a fleet based confidently in Sevastopol. It is acting like a force trying to survive from a safer distance. 10 years ago, Crimea was Putin's greatest victory. Today, it may be turning into his greatest vulnerability. And that is the real story here. Not that Crimea has fallen. It has not. Not that Russia has no cards left. It still does. The real story is that Putin's fortress narrative has collapsed before the fortress itself. And once a fortress stops being believed in, the walls begin to matter less. Because soldiers can see what propaganda cannot hide. They can see commanders leaving. They can see fuel running out. They can see bridges burning. They can see ships gone from port. They can see that the peninsular Russia called permanent is now being treated like a place to escape from. And when that realization spreads, it can do more damage than a missile. So the question now is not simply whether Ukraine can strike Crimea. Ukraine has already proven it can. The question is whether Russia can keep absorbing those strikes without the entire occupation system cracking from the inside. Can Moscow feed the garrison? Can it fuel the vehicles? Can it keep air defense coordinated? Can it keep civilians calm? Can it keep commanders in place? Can it keep pretending Crimea is untouchable when the people responsible for defending it are quietly moving their families out? That is the pressure building under the surface. And if Ukraine continues to strike logistics, energy, transport, and command infrastructure at the same time, the coming months could become the hardest period Russian occupation forces in Crimea have faced since the war began. Putin built Crimea into a fortress over 10 years. Ukraine has spent 4 years turning that fortress into an outpost. And now, the world is watching to see whether that outpost can still be held, or whether the symbol of Putin's greatest triumph becomes the beginning of his most dangerous defeat. If you want more analysis like this, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Crimea can still be defended by Russia? Or are we watching the slow collapse of the fortress Putin promised would stand forever? Because sometimes the fall of a fortress does not begin when the enemy enters. It begins when the commanders start leaving.